Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info
will send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the GLPDC. Today we're talking about systems thinking and pattern language. I am Milton Dixon, and with me I have Rhonda Baird.
Hello.
And William Faith.
Hello.
And to start things off, we always connect with the permaculture flower as a way to orient ourselves with this material. So systems thinking specifically connects with each of the petals of the permaculture flower. Each petal is a system, and they are interrelated, certainly, to form a larger system. The whole flower is a system. And then each petal can also make use of a pattern language, a series of patterns that describe beneficial connections between the elements. So I want to start with talking about the way that I think that we are used to viewing the world, and that's a mechanical view of the universe. We really need to get away from that. That's not how things actually work. It served us to a point, it enabled us to get to where we are, but as we move forward, it's actually going to get us further and further away from reality. It's just a model, and it's served its usefulness.
It has its moments, but I think our very linear sort of reductionist thinking has gotten us into a lot of trouble. I think there's a lot of evidence to support that.
Mm-hmm.
So again, coming from the permaculture flower, all the places that we inhabit are systems. They behave in complex ways, and we can better interact with systems thinking than we can in a direct and linear way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
They're networks of beings that we have the opportunity to engage with, rather than objects for us to control.
Mm-hmm. Well, we could say that a critique of the mechanical model is that it's two variable problems. If I do this, then this happens. But we know that in living systems, there are a multitude of variables interacting together.
Mm-hmm. And it always starts with understanding the intrinsic properties and behaviors of things and expanding out from that.
So in this next slide, in the center we have what I would characterize as a botanist's drawing of corn. On the left, we're looking at what would be a industrially farmed corn. It really exemplifies the control of nature. The rows look totally barren in between. It's only a place for corn. There's no life there. There's no room for the whole ecosystem. On the right, this is more the product, but this is what we might call an Indian corn. This corn represents the diversity that is possible and that was achieved by selective breeding for a long period of time. This is really engaging with the ecosystem and allowing the result to come out, and it gives us a chance to interact with the ecosystem and really avoid unintended consequences. The consequences are apparent as we go. We can control how things work, or we can select for the outcome.
Exactly.
We don't have to determine how the corn grows and how it uptakes water and how it does this and that. We can just let the process exist and interact with it.
And link it to other complementary processes.
Mm-hmm.
If you look on the left, there's very minimal interaction or very tightly controlled interaction. It's not taking advantage of what corn naturally does.
Mm-hmm. This is just such a great illustration of our concept of working with nature instead of trying to control and dominate and ensure particular outcomes, meanwhile causing all kinds of other outcomes that are not accounted for very well. By working with nature, it might be a slower process, but it's to develop so many different varieties or different kinds of resistance or flavors or textures or whatever, but by being patient and working with generations and working with the system itself, there's a greater possibility, more abundance, more life.
So, permaculture makes use of systems thinking tools. The fact that these tools that can be applied in the concrete physical environment and in an invisible structures sense, I think it really demonstrates their universality. All the tools that we described in the design section of this course, tools for working with the land, can also apply to the social spheres. On the left, the ecological theory of development looks very similar to the zones and sectors model, where on the right, the scale of permanence can be represented to be in the physical realm and in the social realm. And people have taken it there.
And there's different thinking models for how you interact with the system. Scale of permanence in particular is you can look at different points where you can intervene for maximum effect. Based on resources, it may be a tight situation where you may not be able to effect a great change on climate, but you can certainly do a lot on microclimate and get the most bang for your buck by doing so. So these are just little tools for thinking about how to integrate with an entire system rather than a very singular linear pattern of thinking.
Mm-hmm. In this slide, these different assessment up in the top left and then the bottom, looking at these different scales of systemic thinking and how new properties emerge when you go from one scale to another, which is an aspect of systems thinking. So there's a lot to be gleaned or understood in terms of individual process and experience, communal or social processes and experience, which is really interesting when you take and compare that to what's on the right with the graph. All these different points, as a designer, what we want to be after is figuring out what we're really assessing, what we're looking at, seeing where there are limiting factors that inhibit the development of the system in a healthy way, and moving towards health, which in a physical way, the scale of permanence helps us do that, although this one also addresses invisible structures as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this next slide is a graphic that depicts different realms of complex systems. And they're really tools that allow us to create from a place of higher order thinking. We're not controlling how the individual elements work, which is often beyond our abilities and undesirable, but we're assembling systems that seem like they should function according to the patterns in front of us, but we're encouraging and allowing the individual elements to make the connections. We're not just pushing them together, they do it on their own. And this creates an environment where new behaviors and functions are emergent. The elements work better, and we get the results that we're after.
Mm-hmm. There's that piece, again, about emergence over scale or development or time. And the pieces do work better together, and new pieces come into play or are attracted to it. The other thing I'll add, and we're going to talk about pattern language soon, is that part of assessing and tweaking as a designer then is about understanding the patterns in play and the dynamic of it over time and how it unfolds and anticipating trends. We can push succession or we can push the pattern along.
Essentially seeing the future.
Yeah.
Well, in the next slide, we're looking at some of the work of Danella Meadows. This kind of came upon her looking at leverage points and the ways that we interact with the world and how much we actually accomplish by working in different realms. If we think about the permaculture principle, make the least change for the greatest effect, thinking about the leverage points and how we can do more with what we have to work with can be really powerful.
Yeah, as I'm looking at each of these, I'm thinking about how permaculture does this. It changes our paradigms. It helps us assess our goals, organize our behaviors, constrains us in different ways, integrates feedback, works with all of these. And so it's very recognizable practice.
And it can sometimes seem like a very academic or pedantic endeavor. There's also a lot of creativity that comes into play here, and that's where I think people can find it a bit dry. But in reality, there's a lot of opportunity to employ these things creatively and adapt and use the patterns that emerge from this in a creative fashion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So again, back to assessment, identification of problems, solving problems. These are the places to come in with solutions based on patterns and principles.
And that's where I always like to mention that yield is only limited by the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. That's just a paradigm.
Really the different lens that you see it through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing I'm just thinking about with this is the whole places in the system where we're relinking for greater efficiency as designers. There's so much inefficiency in our current world view, in our current practices culturally and with materials. And if ecosystems or systems have flows of energy and cycling of materials, these leverage points speak exactly to that basic part of life on the planet.
Speaking of the kind of existing systems, they're so often concerned with numbers and perhaps buffers, those being the least effective ways to make a change. And yet that's what we focus on.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so this next slide, I want to start talking about pattern languages. It's a term originally coined by Christopher Alexander. He used it in his book, A Pattern Language, talking about elements that can exist in successful settlements. And so he went on to delineate a number of patterns that are often present in those settlements. And so running with that idea that a pattern language and having a set of common patterns that can be applied to the idea of building and construction in towns, Peter Bain has taken that and run with that in terms of a set of patterns that can apply to a small permaculture homestead. And Rob Hopkins has taken that into the realm of transition towns and small villages, patterns that small villages can use to apply to make themselves more resilient.
And I would say, the piece about patterns, we've talked about patterns before, how they have repetition and they have form, and so they're non-verbal in that way. And yet when we put in a pattern language, there are many pattern languages, and put that into language, into categories and relationships, that is something we intuitively do, but to consciously do it is sometimes challenging. And a pattern language is structured from the largest overreaching pattern down to tiny little things happening in rooms in a household. These patterns nest within each other, and their relationship, what's the relationship between the street and the front door, or a shop and the apartments above it, right? And then into how we occupy a living room or use a kitchen. All those things have patterns that are healthy, and that's what Alexander was after, was what does it look like when things are really healthy, and how can we move them toward health? And that's where he aligns with permaculture.
And health, to some extent, can almost be dictated by the number of functional relationships between those elements. Mm-hmm. And it becomes fractal all the way down from your living room to the global.
Mm-hmm.
So to give a pretty simple and yet versatile view of a pattern language, this is Hydrodynamics. It's a trademarked system by Tim Winton, who's a permaculturist originally from Canada, and now he's living in Australia. He's just looking at the dynamics, the flows and the patterns of energy that can go on. And he's kind of boiled them down to 7 overarching patterns, and then when those patterns interact with each other, for their 7 patterns for each one. I think if you start to look at this, you can get a feel for what a pattern language might be. This next slide is another example of a pattern language. If you're familiar with David Jackie's Edible Forest Gardens, which he wrote along with Eric Tonesmeyer, this was someone's project where they teased out the patterns that were in the book into a sort of a pattern language.
Mm-hmm. So we could look at this as a designer and see, okay, if we start to think about what are all the key elements, and then what are all the things that make up those elements in a healthy forest garden, then we can start to assess the situation that we have before us and say, what's here, what's missing, what do we do? Or also it can be opportunity for something new and novel to tell us about the system as a whole, right? So forest garden pattern language is going to be very similar from New York to Indiana, but might be a little different in Arizona. So how do we adapt? It can give us clues as to how we adapt a system.
Absolutely. It gives you a general pattern, that you can follow where you're still leaving, you're still tweaking, you're still evaluating for different environments and different circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the Holmgren's design principle to design from patterns to details, right? The
Mm-hmm.
patterns are going to be similar between, New York or Indiana or Arizona, but the details will be different.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way, you can expand that lens out to look at permaculture itself and design in general, that the concepts, the ethics and principles apply universally, but it's the strategies and techniques that will modify based on a number of variables.
This next slide is another pattern language. This is the GroupWorks deck, which is freely available on the internet. These are patterns of groups. So again, you're going to find a lot of these patterns present in various groups, but not all of them and not all the time. And so one group might focus in on the group culture, where another group focuses on the story that makes the work happen. Well, so to bring it back to the permaculture flower, the systems thinking and pattern language can apply to every petal of the flower, and really the flower as a whole, even into permaculture. I mean, that's what permaculture is, a form of systems thinking. We kind of saw a few different pattern languages to get an idea of maybe what they might look like, and in the course we can definitely take at least one for a spin. We've gone through, we're not looking at the world as this mechanical model, but we're really looking at these complex systems that we're trying to interact with and trying to make changes within. We want to try to control the outcome, not so much the process. Let the process fill its own shoes, to be its own thing. And looking at all of these different ways that we can look at larger systems and how we can make the most change possible for the least amount of effort. And then looking at the patterns of these systems and how the patterns interact to form healthy or not healthy systems.